Questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The PBO revealed today that this Prime Minister will apply a second carbon tax on the backs of Quebecers. Beyond all the taxes that Quebecers have to pay on gas already, in addition, he's adding another 17 cents. And he'll apply the sales tax as well, for a total of 20 cents of tax for every liter, for every family, for every farmer, for every company in Quebec. Mr. Speaker, how much will every Quebec family have to pay? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that Quebecers who are listening today know how the fight against climate change is a key issue, and they know how the Conservatives on this question have nothing to say. They have no plan or measures, despite the promises they made during their last election campaign. They don't even believe in the reality of climate change, even though there's flooding in Quebec and record fires in Alberta. I think people expect a responsible government on climate change, and that's not happening with the Conservatives. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. That's absolutely nonsense. The Quebecers are the greenest people in the world, and this Liberal government is preventing construction of dams and other projects for hydroelectricity that is green. At the same time, they want to force Quebecers to pay an additional 20 cents per litre or $500 per family in tax, and they want to do so with the support of the bloc that is wokest, Mr. Speaker. It's only the Conservative Party that has the logic to eliminate this aggressive tax. Mr. Speaker, will the government listen to good sense and axe the tax? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will allow my honourable colleagues from the bloc answer that question to know if they are wokest. I think that's not up for me to say, but I would like to say that once again, the Leader of the Opposition is saying something that's absolutely not true. What we're doing is a mechanism to ensure that refineries who have made record profits in recent years, Mr. Speaker, do their fair share with respect to the climate change crisis. And I think that people expect every areas in the country to do their fair share in terms of climate change. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Saying these things, it is the Parliamentary Budget Officer this government appointed, and just yesterday the Finance Minister said we should believe the Parliamentary Budget Officer. What did he say? He revealed that the first carbon tax will cost 41 cents a litre, and now that there's a second carbon tax of 17 cents a litre, and then when you add the HST on those two taxes, you get a total new tax increase of 61 cents a litre, costing $2,000 a family. How are Canadians going to be able to pay their bills after this new and latest Liberal tax hike?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to quote from the Parliamentary Budget Officer's own analysis, which, and I quote, does not attempt to account for the economic and environmental costs of climate change. He's looking, the Parliamentary Budget Officer is looking at one side of the ledger, Mr. Speaker, without looking at the other side of the ledger. And we know that climate change is already costing Canadians billions of dollars every year. In fact, Mr. Speaker, tens of billions of dollars every year. Of course, if you're the Conservative Party of Canada, you don't believe in climate change and you don't care that those costs to Canadians. But unfortunately, facts are facts, Mr. Speaker, and those costs are real to all Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Climate costs are real, but they will not be reduced as a result of this tax.
Right.
And so the minister's argument leads to a dead end. The Parliamentary Budget Officer said carbon tax 1 would cost 41 cents a litre. Now carbon tax 2, 17 cents a litre. And then they want to tax the tax on the tax by putting HST on top of all that, so it's going to be 61 cents a litre in carbon taxes. We already have 1 in 5 Canadians skipping meals because they can't afford the price of food. How many people are going to go hungry when this government imposes this tax hike?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition is wrong yet again, because our plan is working, and this has led to reduce in emission in Canada and climate change pollution by more than 50 million tons between 2019 and 2021 beyond COVID. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, it's called a pandemic because it was happening all over the world, and yet Canada in 2021 and 2020 and 2021 has the best performance of all G7 countries, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Emissions only went down when they actually locked down the country for COVID, but they want to do that forever. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister decriminalized crack, heroin, and other hard drugs on January the 31st. He's flooded the streets with taxpayer-funded hydromorphine. And today, we have learned the tragic results. The report from British Columbia shows that 7 people are dying every day of overdoses. In April, overdose rates were up 17%. This experiment has failed. When will the Prime Minister get common sense, get drugs off our street, and get our people into treatment?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, our hearts are with all the people the families that have lost their loved one to this terrible crisis caused by a poisoned drug supply. The BC coroner has said there is no evidence that safe supply has been implicated in any of these drug deaths. We have to use every tool in our toolbox to stop this terrible tragedy, and that includes prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and enforcement.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, every day since February, the Bloc has called for a public and independent inquiry into Chinese interference because every day the Liberals have hidden the truth. They knew that China was interfering in the election. They hid it. They knew that China had suspicious ties to one of their MPs. They hid it. They knew that China was involved with the Trudeau Foundation. And above all, Mr. Speaker, they knew that China was threatening elected officials and their families, and they hid it. And above all, they did nothing. That's unforgivable, Mr. Speaker. When will we have a public and independent commission of inquiry? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I didn't know that hiding something means putting it in a public report of CSIS. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, as a government, we acted quickly to establish measures to counter foreign interference, including from China, something that didn't exist before we came to power. We are going to strengthen these measures. We have taken measures to make sure, as my colleague said, that there will be no members that will be threatened by this interference, and we're going to continue in that direction. The Honourable Member for La Prairie, Mr. Speaker, his answer shows that we need a public and independent inquiry. A commission needs to be chosen by this House with a broad mandate so that we can shed full light on this with a clear timetable, one that will begin its work quickly and start work now, not in the fall, right now. It's the only acceptable recommendation that can be arrived at by their rapporteur that is nothing special and really not independent. The Liberals have to stop trying to skirt the issue. Will they commit to this commission immediately? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm a former fisheries minister, and we know that skirting the issue is a tough one. We need to ask for an independent expert like we have in Mr. Johnston. We know that he will table his report next week, and that's exactly the issue that will be looked at in terms of an independent inquiry into foreign interference. We are looking forward to reading these recommendations of Mr. Johnson and would ask the member to allow Mr. Johnson the time to provide his opinion.
Member for Courtney Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals gave over $100 million worth of federal contracts to their friends at McKinsey since 2015, despite McKinsey playing a major role in pushing opioids to vulnerable people. Mr. Speaker, $100 million to a company that worsened the toxic drug crisis. This government even knows McKinsey is terrible, as they've joined a lawsuit to hold the company accountable. So why don't the Liberals stop giving money to McKinsey and use that money to appropriately respond to combating the toxic drug crisis that's killing people in this country?
The Honourable Minister for Procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, Public Services and Procurement Canada is always committed to an open, fair and transparent procurement process while also obtaining the best value for Canadian taxpayers. In the case that the member opposite has alluded to, we of course do also have an integrity regime that we consult regularly, and it is clear in that integrity regime that civil litigation is not a grounds for suspension or department from the existing integrity regime, which was actually put in place by the previous government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Giant housing corporations are treating people's homes like a stock market and evicting longtime tenants to jack up rents. This Minister of Housing thinks a 1% tax on empty homes and a 2-year ban on foreign investments will solve the housing crisis. He is wrong. The housing advocate said these half-liberal measures are dangerous and short-sighted. Financial firms already own 20 to 30% of the rental stock. Will the Liberals stop corporations from getting their hands on more low-cost rental homes with a moratorium and help nonprofits secure these homes with an acquisition fund?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
The honourable member is denying the fact that we're the party in office that brought in the Canada Housing Benefit, a plan to support renters across the country. That is currently helping tens of thousands of vulnerable renters across the country. But in addition to that, we've legislated an annual 1% tax on vacant non-Canadian residential real estate, as well as a 2-year ban on foreign investments in Canadian residential real estate. We're also reviewing the tax treatment of real estate investment trusts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Carbon tax scam 1 costs on average $1,500 net on Canadian families after phony rebates. They just pile drive Canadians with a second scam that will cost Canadians another $500 without any rebates. They hid the facts, but their own budgeting officer exposed these scams. They've made the cost of gas, groceries and home heating more expensive. The first scam hit the most vulnerable Indigenous populations hard. This second scam is going to cripple lower income households even further. Just so Liberals can look more woke while more Canadians go broke. When will they scrap the scams and stop gaslighting Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is that the Conservatives have absolutely no plan to do anything to fight climate change and will set our country back on making promises towards a cleaner economy. When it comes time to ask the oil companies to reinvest their record profits in the innovative solution in clean technologies, the Conservatives immediately back down. We're proud to support the Clean Fuel Regulation, which, when fully implemented, is already contributing more than $2 billion in the last year alone, Mr. Speaker, to the Canadian economy. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Let me sober this out-of-touch orange jumpsuit-wearing minister. Yesterday, Food Bank said that those accessing food charity quadrupled since this Liberal-made inflationary crisis. They already made rents and mortgages double, and to continue down their woke, climate-zealot ideology, they'll take another $2,000 out of the struggling Canadians' pockets while failing to meet any climate targets. How much more woke do they need to go? How much more broke do Canadians need to go before this Prime Minister wakes up?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I'm told that orange is a new black, but to expand on the benefits to the Canadian economy of the clean fuel standard, let me talk about the Tidewater $342 million plant in British Columbia. This year, Mr. Speaker, Imperial Oil, $720...
I'm going to interrupt. We're starting to get noisy. It started off really well. I was really impressed. I just want to make sure that we continue. The Honourable Minister from the top so that everybody's quiet and can hear the answer, please.
Speaker, I'm told that orange is a new black. I would like to further expand on the examples I wanted to give, like the Tidewater $352 million plant in BC. Imperial Oil, all privately funded, $720 million plants for cleaner fuels in Alberta. Federated Co-op's $2 billion plant in Saskatchewan, O'Brien's plant in Newfoundland, which received an added $300 million of private financing in the last month alone, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Prime Minister, Canadians' lives have become more unaffordable. They already have one Liberal carbon tax that is costing Canadians 41 cents per litre. And now there's a second carbon tax that will cost Canadians 17 cents per litre. Once you add a tax on that tax, it's going to cost Canadians 61 cents per litre, making everything more expensive. Why do they continue to force Canadians to pay for their failed policies?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives are going to oppose the clean fuel regulations, which they supported during the last election campaign, they should explain to Canadian farmers, particularly canola growers in Western Canada, why they oppose something that will increase domestic canola demand by over 5 million metric tons and support a strong canola price in this country. Canadians don't need short-term scare tactics, Mr. Speaker. What they're looking for is long-term affordable solutions to the climate crisis, and that's exactly what we're doing on this side of the House.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, their failed carbon tax has not achieved one environmental target that they set. They need to get out of their ideological bubble and go talk to real Canadians who drive for a living. Talk to truck drivers, talk to delivery drivers, talk to cab drivers, go talk to some farmers, and they will tell you the real cost of their failed policies. On July 1st, the second carbon tax will cost Canadians an average of $573. That's on top of the first carbon tax that will cost $1,500. Mr. Speaker, do they really believe that Canadians can afford over $2,000 for carbon tax 1 and 2?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just this week, the Parliamentary Budget Office stated that the effects of climate change bit a $20 billion-sized hole out of Canada's economy in 2021 alone. Mr. Speaker, I understand that the Conservative Party of Canada doesn't believe in climate change, but they pretend to believe in economic responsibility. Why is it that the Conservative Party wants to cancel a market-based mechanism that is putting a price on pollution?
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. $436. That's what the average household in Quebec will pay, in addition to this new tax that applies directly to Quebecers. While more and more people can't afford to buy groceries, fill up their car, and they have to make difficult choices to live, these Liberals and this Prime Minister, who pays his own vacations and gas prices for 10 years, he should take a step back and stop making life more difficult for Quebecers who are having a hard time, who are struggling. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to correct a question that was made by the Conservatives earlier in this House that was talking about a Quebec tax, and the member sent us this tax, and on this report we've seen we have a cap-and-trade system in Quebec. It's a Quebec system that applies to Quebec and not the federal system. Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. 17 cents a litre and new regulations on clean fuel will cost Quebecers $436 more per year. That's the second carbon tax that the minister doesn't seem to want to repeat, Mr. Speaker. No one believes in this minister when he says it doesn't cost Quebecers more and they're not facing the carbon tax. When people buy groceries and they pay for products that were transported across the country, they realize things cost more. They're not crazy. They know it's the carbon tax. Why is the government singling out Quebec with the second carbon tax? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague's statement is false. What we are doing is making sure that refineries who have made record profits in recent years pay their fair share. 26 cents extra on refining margins, and we think that they do have the means to pay for the fight against climate change. And Quebecers who are watching us agree with this, so that all sectors of this society and all parliamentarians work in the fight against climate change. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, 72% of refusals of Francophones from Africa were refused to study in Quebec. We saw this in 2020 and 2021. How come the Minister of Immigration himself last year admitted that there was racism within his own department? Have they done anything to change this? Nothing at all. When will this government stop discriminating against foreign students from Africa chosen by Quebec? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we understand that students and schools who accept them are disappointed when a request is refused. I have to say that I was in Tunisia last year during the Francophonie Summit, and I was able to meet many leaders and stakeholders in our Francophonie to find solutions to this issue. I'd also remind this House that for Francophone students from Africa the acceptance rate has now risen to 35% this year, the Honourable Member. 72% refusals is more than the number of requests refused from Ontario. We're talking about broken dreams, and this pushes Francophones to study elsewhere, even though they're a valuable resource for Quebec. And those who stay in our country after they study here become a strength for our nation. When will the government stop hindering our students? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I agree with my colleague. We need these people to come here, and that is why we established a direct study program in Senegal and Morocco to accelerate requests. The approval rate was improved, and we know that we still have work to do, and we recognized the clear societal advantages, cultural and economic advantages that international students bring to Canada and to Quebec. We're doing everything we can, Mr. Speaker, to make it easier for students to come. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, it's even more enraging because the government spends its time giving Quebec lessons, even though we know that they're breaking the dreams without any justification, and it doesn't make sense. These decisions are unjustified, and even the minister has realized that there is prejudice and this injustice keeps continuing. They should put the same amount of energy to fair treatment of people as they do to their nice speeches. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, foreign students, as I said, bring an important contribution to Canada, and we've heard them very clearly. That is why we extended work permits that were on the verge of expiring, which allowed more than 100,000 graduates to remain in our country. We also allowed 500,000 students to benefit from off-campus work. Canada and will always be a destination of choice for students.
Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, I would encourage the Minister of Environment to go talk to a farmer, because I haven't spoken to a single one that supports the first carbon tax, let alone carbon tax number 2. And the Agriculture Minister admitted yesterday she has no idea what the impact carbon tax 2.0 will have on farmers or the cost of food. Here's what we do know. When the Liberals triple their first carbon tax, fuel goes up 41 cents a litre, diesel goes up 15 cents a litre, and the cost of food 34%. When they implement carbon tax number 2, the cost of fuel goes to 61 cents, diesel 25 cents a litre. Can the Minister of Agriculture confirm that the carbon tax 2.0 will be exempt from coloured farm fuel?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the first people impacted by the climate crisis are our farmers, and they have always worked to have the most sustainable agriculture possible. They've improved their practices to have the best equipment and to do R&D in this respect. We are here to support our farmers while the Conservatives take them for granted. We have a vision for the future for them.
Here's the problem, Mr. Speaker. The minister has no idea what the impact of Carbon Tax 2.0 is going to have on the cost of food, the impacts on farmers, the cost to transport that food, or the cost of Canadians to actually buy that food. Right. And the first carbon tax is already sending Canadians to the food banks in shocking numbers. The number of trips to the food bank is up 60% in 2003. That is 8 million Canadians going to the food bank every single month. How much will Canadians have to pay to put food on the table when the Liberals implement Carbon Tax 2.0? Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, I announced a new $10 million for the infrastructure fund for local food organizations, nonprofit organizations, including food banks, community gardens, and greenhouses, to apply because it allowed them to acquire new equipment. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi. Mr. Speaker, with Liberal inflation, Canadians' paychecks no longer allow them to make ends meet. The Liberals already have a carbon tax that cost 41 cents more per litre of gas, but now we've learned that they're adding a second carbon tax on top of the first. This means the two taxes combined will represent 61 cents more per litre, increasing the price of transportation and food. When will the Liberals eliminate the double carbon tax to allow Canadians to breathe a bit more? Because right now they're suffocating. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to remind my honourable colleague that Quebec has its own cap-and-trade system, which is a system that is completely different than that of the federal solution, and they have a price on pollution. And if he would like a technical briefing from my department about how this Quebec system works, I'd be happy to offer him one.
Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The average rent in Coquitlam is now $2,800, the third highest in the country. Seniors, single mothers, and people with disabilities are being evicted as their long-time rental homes are being replaced with luxury condos. I met a single mom whose rent went up 50% just so that she could stay in her community after she was displaced by a for-profit developer. This is unacceptable. What are the Liberals going to do to keep rents affordable? Because what they're doing now is not working.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member knows or should know that rent control is under provincial jurisdiction. However, we on this side of the House believe that the federal government has a role and should play a role in helping renters. That is why we introduced the Canada Housing Benefit. That is why we partnered with political parties on this side of the House to make sure that we top up the Canada Housing Benefit, which is going to every vulnerable renter across Canada that needs it. It's a cost-shared program, and we're proud of that record.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, the average rent for a one-bedroom in Victoria is a whopping $2,000, and a two-bedroom is $2,600. Young people, seniors, those on fixed incomes can't afford these enormous rents. People in my riding are being hit hard. Many are without a home, in housing that doesn't meet their needs, facing rent evictions, or unable to save for the future. For every one affordable unit built, we are losing 15 affordable homes. So why do the Liberals refuse to take on giant housing corporations, and why are they failing to increase the supply of affordable rentals?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the NDP loves to bring up provincial jurisdiction issues. However, we do believe that the Government of Canada has a role to support renters. That's why we introduced the Canada Housing Benefit. And as far as building more rentals is concerned, we're the government that introduced the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, which is about building more rental supply in Canada, including affordable rentals. And we're now moving forward with the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is about building more supply, including more affordable housing, but also more affordable rentals.
The Honourable Member for Steveston, Richmond East.
Mr. Speaker, temperatures in Western Canada remain high, and so have the fire risks. Thousands remain evacuated in Alberta, and we have seen more evacuation orders in recent days from communities in the Northwest Territories and my home province of British Columbia. We have seen this government step up when Alberta reached out for help, providing CAF and other federal support, but this is just the start of Canada's wildfire season. Can the Minister of Emergency Preparedness update this House on what he and this government is doing to help currently affected communities and ensure all regions have the support they need?
The Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Speaker, first of all, let me thank the member from Stevenson, Richmond East, for his very important question. And I'd like to begin my answer by acknowledging the incredible work of firefighters, first responders, and volunteers who have stepped up and are supporting those who have been displaced. Mr. Speaker, here today, we've heard a lot about the cost of fighting climate change. But, Mr. Speaker, we have evidence before us this week of the cost of inaction. And when we fail to respond, we can see that literally tens of thousands of people have been displaced from their homes. Over 700,000 hectares of forest has been burned. And the cost of assisting those people through recovery is unsustainable. Mr. Speaker, we have to take action, and we are.
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
The news out of the PBO this morning is shocking. A second carbon tax. That would add another 17 cents on a litre of gas, increasing it from 41 cents to 61 cents. Wow. As the adage goes, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are no fools, and this government should be ashamed of its campaign of punitive raids on the bank accounts of Canadians to bankroll their historic debt. Mr. Speaker, with the cost of gas, heat, and groceries ballooning, does this out-of-touch government really think Canadians can afford this debilitating hit to their finances?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So when the Conservative Party of Canada in the 2021 election campaigned on bringing carbon pricing to $170 a ton, or putting in place a clean fuel regulations, were they trying to fool Canadians? Is that what we're to understand, Mr. Speaker? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Coast of Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister has been dodging questions about her second carbon tax ever since she came back to work. Well, now we finally have the answer thanks to the PBO. Now, this additional 17 cents a litre is even going to be charged on fuel used by our fishermen. Oh, no. And for families in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's going to be an extra $850 a year. Combined with her original carbon tax, it's going to be $2,000 per year for those families. Unbelievable. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, when is this Liberal government going to stop trampling on the people of Newfoundland and Labrador and axe this useless carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, our plan is working. We've reduced carbon pollution by more than 50 million tons. Canada has the best emission reduction profile of all G7 countries in 2020 and 2021. And what we're doing for the great people of Newfoundland, Mr. Speaker, is helping them land investment of more than $300 million in the last month alone in the new Bryanus plant biorefinery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the government said, and not quite correctly, that his plan was working. The UN published a report last fall that said that Canada came 58th out of 63 countries on climate change. And he says everything's going well. What's worse, the PBO today confirmed the report, saying that the second Liberal carbon tax would cost the average Quebec family $436. In Montreal, 1 in 5 families doesn't have enough to afford food. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I could cite a long list of independent organizations that have all said our plan is working and that our greenhouse gas emissions have started to decrease.
there's Equiterre, eco-justice, environmental defense. They've all publicly said that our climate change plan is starting to work. There's a lot of work still to be done. I'm the first to admit that. But the last thing we need is the Conservatives who would yank us back 20 years in time when it comes to dealing with climate change. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, 58th, the minister responsible for ranking us 58th, talked about Equiterre. Mr. Speaker, 30 years ago, he was the founder of Equiterre. And he sued the then Environment Minister, saying that his promises were all talk and no action. Who said that? The founder of Equiterre. The situation is troubling for Quebec families. They're going to have to pay $436 more. How are they supposed to be able to afford that? Sorry. I just have a quick comment. I'd like to remind members that when you refer to another member, you refer to them either by their title or by their riding name, not by a made-up title. I know people have a lot of imagination, but that's the rule. The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Allow me to cite a few quotes from experts. Alison Simard said that the Liberals' reduction plan would be beneficial from the Climate Action Network. The city of Quebec City is pleased with this plan. It's crucial to the future of our cities and future generations. So these are all allies of the Liberal government, not the Conservative Party. The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, there's an illegal landfill in Kanesatake that's been contaminating the drinking water of 1 million people for years. It's a complex problem that needs to be addressed. It's unacceptable to see the federal government abdicating its responsibilities and passing them off on the SQ. Enough of this buck passing. What's at stake is the drinking water of 1 million people. The federal government can't continue to let the situation degenerate. What's the Minister of the Environment doing about this urgent matter? The Honourable Environment Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I've had conversations with him about this, as has the minister, the Quebec minister responsible for Indigenous relations, and the federal ministers. It's a complex problem that we can't make simple. There's no simple solution to. Everyone has a role to play. The Band Council, the Quebec government through the SQ, and the federal government also has a role to play. We're in discussion with the Band Council and the Government of Quebec in order to find a sustainable solution to this problem. The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, the federal government should stop passing the buck and take the lead, show some leadership. In an interview on Radio-Canada, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations said, we have to let go of this idea that every time there's a few Indigenous people involved in an issue, it's the federal government's problem. Mr. Speaker, the community of Kanesatake is asking for help. So is Oka and the whole region. The federal government can proceed with the decontamination. So yes, this is very much the federal government's problem. When is Ottawa going to call the communities together to come up with a concrete, quick solution? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Mr. Speaker, the only party who's passing the buck is the Bloc Québécois. I myself acknowledged yesterday in an interview with La Presse that the federal government had a role to play. We are going to play that role. Just yesterday, the Minister for Indigenous Services talked with the band leader. So we have our job to do. We will find a solution.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government has now spent $3.5 million on vending machines for this Liberal government's failed unsafe supply experiment. These vending machines are dispensing hydromorphone, which is more potent than heroin. There are such machines, 3 of them in Vancouver and 1 in Victoria.
And the sad reality, Mr. Speaker, is that opioid deaths have continued to increase. In the last 2 years, they have gone up 17%. When will the Minister of Addiction stop this failed experiment and give way to compassionate treatment for those suffering from addictions?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, yet again, the failed Conservative policies surface where people, without harm reduction, people don't live long enough to get to treatment. Polarizing the difference between treatment and harm reduction is really, really unhelpful. We need all aspects of internationally accepted drug policy, prevention and education, harm reduction, treatment, as well as enforcement. Diversion is illegal.
The Honourable Member for Mission Metzke Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the decriminalization of hard drugs by the Liberals and NDP, we've seen a record number of opioid deaths in the province of British Columbia. Not only that, this government has failed to uphold its part of the agreement as it relates to the protection of children. Why has this government not done more to protect kids from exposure to crack pipes and needles at schools and parks across British Columbia, despite it still being illegal?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, I think every member of the House understands that the increase in opioid deaths is because the extraordinarily toxic drug supply that came in after the reduction of deaths in 2019 in British Columbia. So this is hugely important. The exemption that we have approved in British Columbia specifically says that playgrounds and areas attached to schools and daycares is not exempt, and that those must be enforced.
Member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Conservatives know that a healthy recovery is the answer to the captivity of addiction. 34,000 Canadians have died from opioids from 2016 to 2022 alone. Today, we're told Ottawa plans to join a BC class action, accusing its favorite $100 million consultant, McKinsey, that turbocharged opioid sales of reckless opioid marketing. This is a copycat of what Conservatives called for on March 14th. Why did it take this Liberal government 2 years after the U.S. settlement to sue McKinsey and Big Pharma?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the opposition is behind the times. It's been since 2018 that we have been working with British Columbia in the litigation against Big Pharma and those who enabled them. And we are part of the Purdue settlement in June. At our request, BC also amended their legislation to reinforce the federal government's participation in these class actions. Canada has also addressed pharma's predatory practices by further restricting the marketing of opioids and increasing maximum financial penalties.
The Honourable Member for Sudbury. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the Conservatives' flip-flop on pollution pricing. In 2007, the Harper government proposed a $15 carbon tax. In 2008, the same government promised to introduce a cap-and-trade system. In 2011, they scrapped that idea, along with any and all other climate measures. And in the 2021 election, they came around on carbon pricing again. It's nonsense, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change please tell the House about the ambitious climate action our government is proposing to ensure a healthy environment? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her question. When it comes to climate change, Canadians expect the government to take action, and that's precisely what we're doing. With a price on pollution that encourages industry to reduce emissions, an emissions reduction plan for all sectors of the economy, a cap-and-trade system for the gas sector, and a national climate change adaptation strategy. Meanwhile, It's been 250 days since the leader of the opposition became leader of the Conservative Party, and not only does he still have no climate plan, he continues to deny the climate crisis. The honourable member for Charlesbourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, Quebec's Minister of Higher Education has called on universities to cancel partnerships with Huawei, which is a threat to Canada's security. And since it's a federal matter of national security, she also called on the Prime Minister to provide the provinces with guidance on Biden banning Huawei from provincial institutions. She's asked, but this Liberal government refuses to respond. Since the very beginning, the Prime Minister has been dragging his feet. But the danger's real. When will he give Minister Derry an answer?
Responsibility, federal and provincial governments, universities, and researchers. Now, in February, we made our position clear on the protection of Canadian research and intellectual property. We've introduced new and much more rigorous approaches to expect all partners to take similar measures as well. We'll continue working to promote an open and collaborative research system while safeguarding national security. Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the World Health Assembly will be meeting next week in Geneva. Taiwan had an exemplary response to the recent global COVID-19 pandemic and has much to contribute to pandemic preparedness and global health initiatives. My question to the government, does Canada support Taiwan's participation at next week's World Health Assembly?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, Canada reconfirms our support of Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations. Its absence would be detrimental to global interest. That's why we support Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly and the World Health Organization. Taiwan's participation would benefit both the people of Taiwan and those around the world. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in our relationship with Taiwan while working to enhance peace and stability across the strait. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, G7 leaders will meet this weekend in Hiroshima, Japan, where the nuclear bomb was first used. They are expected to meet survivors of that bomb. They are also expected to issue a joint statement on the use of nuclear weapons in light of Russia's threats against Ukraine and the West. Will the government take this opportunity at the G7 to urge our closest ally, the United States, to resume the strategic stability dialogue on nuclear weapons with Russia?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd like to thank the honourable member for that very important question. I'd also like to thank Japan for prioritizing this as part of the G7. Canada believes in a world free of nuclear weapons, and the current arsenals around the world remain far too large. We call on Russia to fulfill its international obligations, including under the New START Treaty. Putin's rhetoric is dangerous and reckless. Russia needs to end their unjustified war and come to the table for peace talks. We will continue to work with our allies towards this very crucial goal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Ontario's green belt is a crown jewel, protecting nearly 2 million acres of environmentally sensitive land. Yet, Doug Ford calls the green belt a scam. It's clear he's working to parcel it off to his developer friends. We can't let him do that. What does the Minister of Environment think of Premier Ford calling the Greenbelt a scam, and will he stand up for the Greenbelt with every tool available?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I profoundly disagree with the characterization that the Premier of Ontario has made about the Greenbelt. Protecting green spaces so that our kids and grandkids can have access to green spaces, to clean air and clean water is no scam, Mr. Speaker. Working to ensure that our kids and grandkids continue to have a bright future is no scam, Mr. Speaker, and the federal government will use all of its available tools to ensure that we can continue protecting the lands in the Greenbelt as well as jewels like the Rouge National Park. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Vancouver, Kingsway.
A new report shows the number of Canadian teenagers regularly vaping is now shockingly among the highest in the world. This puts the health and lives of youth at great risk, and experts say it is Liberal inaction fueling this growing crisis. The government's refusal to take on big tobacco is allowing them to use flavored products to hook a new generation of Canadians. Why are Liberals standing back while big tobacco uses flavors like cotton candy to lure teenagers to become addicted to nicotine?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad and grateful for this question. We have indeed met with a number of key stakeholders in the area, including this morning the Canadian Cancer Society. We are grateful for all of their input. We know how tremendous the impact of vaping and smoking is in our society, including for younger Canadians and youth, and that's why we have already put into place strong regulations over the last few years on packaging, publicity and content of vaping products, and we'll be doing more.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moments ago, the Minister of Environment said he'll use every tool available to the federal government. Those tools are lying idle while Doug Ford revs up the bulldozers. We know that we could use endangered species legislation, look at impact assessment, but probably the strongest tool is the international, legally binding agreement of the Great Lakes Annex to prohibit the movement of water within the Great Lakes from basin to basin. 8 U.S. states, 2 Canadian provinces, and 2 federal governments stand behind that annex. When will the federal government stand up and demand that the Ontario government, under whose signature Mike Harris signed that accord, will live up to its terms?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Speaker, as the member well known, we can use the Species at Risk Act once projects are being proposed. No such projects have been proposed so far, but we have already started an impact assessment review of the impacts of said development on the Rouge National Park. We did not wait. We're already acting, and we're looking at other areas of Ontario where we could launch similar studies to look at what the impacts of dezoning the Greenbelt lands could be on federal protected lands. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have today for the questions. I wish to draw the attention of the members to the presence in the gallery of the 2023 Killam Prize laureates, which are awarded to Canadian scholars who have distinguished themselves through sustained research, excellence in